This might be a bonkers request, but for science, hear me out. Have you considered comparing what it would be like to run a game like Cyberpunk at 200 FPS on a 5090 without using any of the AI, adjusting the settings accordingly, and comparing with the 5080 with all the AI trickery, also at 200 FPS, and seeing what the difference is in image quality and input lag? I want to suss out whether AI is as good as all that, or if it's just smoke and mirrors, double question mark. Keeping it classy, blokes, exclamation point. Well, we're still sort of trying to figure out how to fully test MFG, multi-frame generation, in a way that's meaningful. There's been plenty of good stuff out there so far, I think. But absolutely, the concept of targeting a frame rate, although I don't know, it's certainly a way to compare the impact of MFG, right, Alex?
Yeah, it would. I mean, so there are differences. The one thing is, I don't know if MFGs, I mean, advertising is one thing, but if we're just realistic about what it is doing, we know it cannot possibly be the exact same thing as a natively rendered FPS experience.
Yeah.
It will be different. It'll be worse in input latency, and it'll have a higher propensity for more visual artifacts in certain screen areas or conditions that the game could find itself in. So that test tells us something that we already know from the onset, and it's interesting from an academic perspective, but it doesn't talk about what is the subjective experience of not having it versus having it. And
right.
I find that more compelling from a use case perspective, because that tells us like a scenario where how many people are going to run Cyberpunk at a native 200 FPS? Or would they rather do something that allows them to play the game the way they couldn't have played it before, with things like path tracing, etc. So, I mean, it's interesting, but once again, like, just fulfilling the academic need to point out something, it's probably very interesting in the form of a video pointing it out, but it's not going to get us anywhere further, especially in like 5 to 10 years when everyone's using MFG. And now we've got this, like, how do we start talking about it then when it's, I was going to say gang und gäbe, but like when it's like the thing that everyone's using and everyone has. And like, then how do we start talking about the subjective experience of playing a game? What is our new metric for talking about games at that point in time? And I want to start working towards that direction instead of kind of sitting in the mire of how we would talk about it, versus like super sampling, like that doesn't bring us much further to a new way to appreciate games. So that's what I want to try and do when we get around to this. And it's going to be coming soon enough. But like, when I talk about MFG, I do want to try and focus the video in a way that hones in on what it is doing actually from a gaming perspective. So that's the way I'm looking at it.
Thoughts, Oliver?
I mean, just my immediate response to this question is like, if you have a 5080 with ray reconstruction, with reflex, with frame generation, as opposed to a 5090 with none of those features, I mean, I think the 5080 is pretty clearly going to win that comparison in terms of hitting really high frame rates with ray tracing, in terms of looking like really, really good and reasonably responsive there. I think you can probably have a great experience. I think it wouldn't be very competitive, but I also think that kind of academic use case is not that important in a title like Cyberpunk, where I think so much of that visual experience is tied up in trying to achieve higher settings using ray reconstruction, using all that AI trickery as this user suggests. I think it's so integral to the experience that comparing it to like a native 200 FPS experience on a 5090, I think that's just a misuse of the hardware. I don't think that's correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably a more telling comparison, bearing in mind NVIDIA is trying to tell us that a 5070 is as good as a 4090 in performance terms, is actually to test those particular claims, but it's not going to be. I mean, in the 5080 review, what I did do was to get some input metrics and frame rate metrics together that would compare like 5080 at 3 and 4x MFG versus 4090 at 2x. And the frame rate is higher. on the 5080, but also the latency is higher. It's interesting to see the extent to which that matters. I mean, 3x MFG on Cyberpunk was like 16% faster than 2x on 1490 and like 46% faster with 4x. But then you look at the latency metrics and let's have a look here. Actually, I'm just brought up the page. We're on like essentially 39 milliseconds of latency with that 1490. And then looking at the 5080 with the quote unquote faster frame rate, basically for that 16% of extra frame rates, you're paying 10 milliseconds of latency. But for the 46% of extra frame rate, you're paying 12 milliseconds. So there's an interesting balancing act going on there in terms of smoothness versus fluidity.